Welcome to the Excruciating Minutiae Podcast, where we obsess about sports, pop culture, and politics. But mostly sports. Here are your hosts, Randy and Steven.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Excruciating Minutia. I'm Randy. I'll be joined shortly by Steven. And before we begin, I'll ask if you please go ahead and check us out at excruciatingpodcast.com with links to all the different places that you can catch every one of our episodes. And today's episode, we're going to be talking about the year 1989 as we go into part 3 of our retrospective look back at that very momentous year and all the big things that happened in it. And today, we're going to be talking about something that's near and dear to Steven's heart, and that's going to be music. And Steven, I'm probably going to be deferring more to you on this one because, I love music. It's not that I don't listen to music, but I think you're a lot more of the historian or the expert on musical trends and some of these musical artists than I am. And this is kind of going to be your baby in some aspects, but it was a big year in music. And you can go ahead and talk, I guess, about it being a very transitionary time in the music industry, correct?
It was getting to be. So the 80s kind of, everyone remembers it the 80s was the beginning of MTV, right? That started, I believe, in 1981. And by 89, it was really in its kind of full-blown, people went to MTV to actually watch music videos, not watching reality shows. So it was a big thing. It wasn't just about dropping the music. It was about having a video to go along with it because that's what sold records. Or at that time, in the 80s, we started getting into CDs, right?
Yeah, that was the time.
Trying to think of when I had my first CD player. I'm going to say somewhere around 86, 87 is when I got my first CD player. And prior to that, everything was on cassette tape.
Yep. And you're right about like you mentioned MTV. And like I said, anyone who's under the age of 21 doesn't remember MTV as actually a music channel and may not even realize the M in MTV stands for music television, right? But back in the day, it was MTV and it was VH1 was the other counterpart that played music videos. And that was a big thing. You're absolutely right. I think TBS ran a music video show late at night on the weekends, either on Friday or Saturday, like an hour with popular videos and popular music songs. And I guess they still make those today, do they? I mean, I saw Miley Cyrus had that, Wrecking Ball one, recently, right? I mean, they still do kind of that thing today, but not really.
You can find it on some channels that they might have like an hour of videos, but there's not as much it's not really that big of a thing anymore. You're right. But I mean, back in the day, it was so groundbreaking. I mean, I don't know about you, I would sit and watch like MTV for hours at a time.
Yeah.
It was really something I had never seen. It really was at the time I was in kind of a rural area. I was living outside of Rochester, New York, kind of in the sticks, and we didn't have great radio stations there. And so that was my introduction to kind of like cutting edge music because it wasn't being played in my local radio station.
That is true. MTV was certainly a forerunner for bringing artists and certain types of music to the forefront that you might not have heard, like you said, by listening to your local radio. And this list, you have a top 10 songs for that year. That's a really wide range and mix and variety, right? I mean, we're kind of all over the place with this.
We are. We're very much all over the place. The number one song was Look Away from Chicago, when Chicago's heyday really was the 70s into the early 80s. And this was kind of like this may have been their last number one song. But Chicago really wasn't the band you would have thought you would have seen at the top of the charts in 1989. Some of the other songs in that top 10 is My Prerogative by Bobby Brown. Now, that's a song that you would expect to see. And, that you started seeing a lot of music like that. There was music from Bobby Brown, Paula Abdul. In fact, Paula Abdul had 2 of the top 10 songs that year with Straight Up and Cold Hearted.
She really broke out as a big star in that year. Obviously, was 89. She's known again today. If you ask younger people, all you know her from is, well, she's that judge on American Idol, right? That's what people know her for. But I remember when she was in the top 10, as you said. And Straight Up was a monster hit. And then, she did Cold Hearted, and there was probably something else on that first album she released that did okay. But, that even now on radio stations, because yes, I still listen to the radio. What minority does that put me into? But when I'm in the car, I'll listen to the radio, and then, you still hear that on a lot of classic rock stations. Is that a sign we're getting old, that the classic rock stations now are playing music? Like when I was younger and I'd hear a classic rock station, they'd be playing like 50s and 60s stuff. And now the classic rock station is playing stuff that I grew up with. Is that a sign that we're getting really old now?
Yeah. I can remember growing up in the 70s, right?
Yeah.
And my parents would listen to what they called oldies, which is the music that they grew up with in the 50s. And it seemed like so long ago. And it was only 20 years. We're talking about 30 years ago from now. And for me, it seems like just yesterday.
Yeah. Now we know how our parents felt, right?
Right. But I didn't understand it at that time. Think about it. You're in the 70s. The 50s seems so long ago. The 50s, it's 2 different decades ago.
Yeah.
We're now talking about 3 different decades ago. And I'm looking at this saying, oh, yeah, I remember when that came out. I remember that video. I must have seen it 25 times a month. It was like on every day.
There's definitely some classic songs on this list. And when you start getting into some of the other top ones that you'll hear on the classic music stations, you'll hear like karaoke bars, you'll hear played still on the, like I said, not only on the radio, but in live event type things. Some other ones that you don't really hear, but we'll get to one here when you get to the other top ones. And I'm like, oh yeah, I hear that and that stays on. I can still jam out to that, because it's a great song, but we'll get to that. I'll let you keep moving through here. So you mentioned Paula Abdul, another couple female artists on this list.
Bette Midler is on this list. It may be her only top 10 pop hit, Wind Beneath My Wings, which was from the movie Beaches. She did have a cameo on Seinfeld. There's our little connection there, playing herself. In fact, I seem to remember Kramer singing Wind Beneath My Wings to her in the episode. But again, it's kind of, it's a very pop song. I mean, just almost felt out of place for the time when you compare it to like Straight Up and Cold Hearted
or like I said, My Prerogative, which was very catchy and had a very good beat, and just, you couldn't be any further from Wind Beneath My Wings than that, right? I mean, and yet here they are.
You could be a little bit away from that. The song after that was a little bit different than that. So Bette Midler's song was number 7 for 1989. Number 8, the infamous Milli Vanilli with Girl, You Know It's True. So there you have 2 guys who weren't even singing, and Bette Midler, who's a phenomenal singer, right?
Couldn't be any more different than that, yes.
What we didn't know in 1989 was that Milli Vanilli couldn't sing. It would basically be like you and me singing. Not something that anyone would pay. They'd pay us not to sing, is what they would do.
If we were Milli Vanilli, we'd be moving our lips to someone else's singing, right? And then that
Correct.
Would be...
We never looked as cool as they did, though.
Well, yeah. I'll grant you that.
Don't even make an argument that you did at one time.
And we don't own a Grammy, though I think they took that away from them. But they won a Grammy, didn't they, as Best New Artist?
Yeah, well, it happens.
Oops.
It happens.
I will connect this to show that I know a little bit about music. Do you remember the group CNC Music Factory that came along a little bit after that?
Oh, absolutely.
There was a controversy about them in that, if you remember the music video, it was that first hit they had, right? Which again was
You mean the one hit they had? Gonna Make You Sweat.
They had a couple other songs that got radio play and weren't bad, but yeah, that was
They're known for that one song.
That's the one song that was their big hit. And in the music video, they have a female, very attractive female doing the singing. And apparently that's not her on the actual album. The person who was doing the actual vocals when this person in the video was singing was somebody who was a little bit on the larger side and a little bit less attractive. So they actually caught some flack for that, for misrepresenting. And I think the actual singer was a little upset that it was misrepresented in the video. So I don't know if they ended up changing it. So even the lessons of Milli Vanilli, you still saw that in later years, obviously. But
if I'm not mistaken, they're back touring again, and the woman who actually sang is their singer. That was a very distinctive, memorable song. That song, if I'm not mistaken, came out in '90, so that was the next year. That was a year later.
The Milli Vanilli thing, we talked about it before the podcast, and you mentioned basically that there were instances of what we would, I guess, call session musicians, guys who would play for certain bands in recording studios that weren't actually touring with them on the road. But at least in some of these cases with these bands, when they did perform live, the actual band members played or at least did the singing. In Milli Vanilli's case, they really did nothing. They lip sync and they danced, right? I mean, that was it. They performed live in concert, didn't they? I mean, when I say performed, I'll put that in air quotes, but they did go on the road, did they not?
Yes, they did.
And it was just a sham.
It was, but even artists who are able to perform have been caught lip syncing. I seem to remember there being an episode on...
I know what you're thinking of. Saturday Night Live? Or you're thinking of...
Yeah.
Ashley Simpson, right?
Right. But it turned out apparently she was sick and her voice was terrible that day and she didn't want to cancel. But she could sing. That's the difference. But yeah, you talk about session musicians. I mean, back in the 60s, that's what they did. They created these songs, then they created the group, and then they would be like, okay, this is the look we want, and this is the music we want, and then we're going to hire these session musicians. One of the biggest was called the Wrecking Crew, and that's kind of meaningful today because one of the members of the Wrecking Crew passed away today. His name is Hal Blaine. He was the drummer, and one guy played drums on 40 number one singles and 150 top 10 tunes. But you didn't know him as the drummer for any of them, but he did work for the Beach Boys, Elvis Presley, Sonny and Cher, Mamas and the Papas, Simon and Garfunkel, the Byrds, Frank Sinatra, the Ronettes, like the beginning of Be My Baby, which has a very iconic drum beginning. He's the guy who played the drums.
Yeah. Wow.
But that was very common in the 60s. What happened in the 70s, one of the members of that group ended up becoming a star. And that guy was Glen Campbell. So Glen Campbell was part of the Wrecking Crew, was a session musician for years. And then he was discovered, quote unquote, and they gave him the avenue to become a star. And then that became the trend. It was like the singer-songwriter or somebody who could actually do that. Then that became the trend. And then that formula to put together music changed after that point. But it was brought back in the 80s. In a lot of these things, it was less about the music and more about the video.
The presentation,
the dancing. Madonna is super talented. She's a great singer, but she became who she is because of the look, because of the videos that she did. That's really what...
Would you say MTV made Madonna? Like if Madonna was in the 70s, would Madonna have been as big a star as she was? Or did MTV and like you said, the visual presentation make Madonna the big star that she was? And Madonna, again, ultra talented. And I loved Madonna's music, and she was putting out good music, a huge collection we could put together of great Madonna songs, right? Would she have been as big if this had been 10 years before?
Maybe not. Maybe not. I feel like she was...
Right place, right time.
It was. She was tailor-made for MTV.
Oh, yeah.
She came onto the scene right when MTV was becoming big, right? And they loved her, and she was on all the time, and it was like this symbiotic relationship. They were good for her. She was good for them. And that's what really drove it. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, that's kind of what drove people to buy music, was what they saw. We weren't listening to the radio at that point. The radio ceased to become a thing. Kind of like the radio now is not a thing at all. Now it's all about streaming or YouTube, right?
Yeah.
Now we're going back to that, watching music or watching things, but it's all YouTube based.
Yeah.
And then the beauty of that is that I don't need to be discovered by a record producer. I can put out my own stuff anytime I want. And these people become YouTube stars doing their own stuff. And then the record industry finds them. Going back to the music. So you had all this going on. one of the songs I skipped for a reason. The number 3 song that year was Every Rose Has Its Thorn by Poison. So a hair band had the number 3 pop song in 1989. Think about that. So it was a power ballad. You know, you had Chicago, Bobby Brown, Poison, Paula Abdul, Janet Jackson, Bette Midler, Milli Vanilli. We didn't even get into the last 2, Will to Power and Anita Baker. You mentioned to me you hadn't even heard of Will to Power. I know you've heard the song, Baby I Love Your Way, Freebird, medley.
Yeah.
It was a mashup of those 2 songs, and again, that band was, I can't name another song that they did, but it was a very iconic song.
I'll have to look it up on YouTube afterwards to see if I even remember hearing the song. But yeah, I had no clue who they were.
The song is linked right there. You can click on it and it'll play the song for you there. So,
like you said, the individual songs that were mashed up, absolutely. But yeah, I don't remember that one. Now, Anita Baker, I called her before the podcast the poor man's Whitney Houston. She had a beautiful voice and I loved her stuff. I believe she may have won a Grammy.
Yeah, she won for Best R&B Vocal Performance for Giving You the Best That I Got.
Yeah.
And Best Rhythm and Blues Song.
Yeah, she was good. Again, I compared her to Whitney Houston to somebody one time, and they're like, "Oh, nobody's as good as Whitney." I'm like, I'm not saying she's as good as Whitney Houston. I'm just saying her songs had that sort of, like I said, she had great range, and I loved her. I thought she was fantastic. You know, so I remember her, and I remember some of the songs on that top 10. A couple of them I wish I didn't remember, and, you know, and like I said, in one I had absolutely no clue, but I probably did hear it at some point and just maybe I blocked it out of my mind. But lots of other big songs that year, though. It wasn't just these top 10. There were some other pretty influential. In fact, there's some pretty big names that weren't in the top 10. The fact that Milli Vanilli is in the top 10 and some of these other artists are not is just an embarrassment that we should all be ashamed of in some fashion. Because, again, go through some of these other top songs that we had back in 1989.
Sure. The one that stands out to me, and again, because it had an iconic video and because there was a lot of history notes in the song, right? We Didn't Start the Fire by Billy Joel, right? Talking about all the things that were happening, you know, through the 50s and 60s, 70s and 80s.
I will say I have a love-hate relationship with that song, is that there's part of me that appreciates it and the ability to weave through history, especially with the video and everything. It's a good history lesson. And there's the other part of me that just feels like that song is damn repetitive. Right? It just seems, isn't it? It just repeats the same lyric beat and then the same chorus beat and just with different words. And I mean, I know a lot of songs do that, but it's one of those, it feels like it goes on sometimes when I listen to it and on and on and on. So sometimes I like listening to it when I hear it, and other times I'm like, oh God, I can't hear this. You need to shut this off.
It's not his finest song by any measure. He has many other songs that are far better, but from a video standpoint, very iconic video and a song that you hear it now, you know exactly who it is.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Even to this date, 30 years later, you hear that song, you're like, oh, it's Billy Joel. Other songs.
The next one on the list is, again, that's my, not a guilty pleasure, but it's one of my favorites out of all the ones you have on the list.
It is probably a top 10 karaoke song of all time.
Oh, absolutely.
Love Shack by the B-52s. The B-52s were very much a kind of a punk, cutting edge, new wave band. But when Love Shack came out, that kind of transitioned them into more of a pop type sound. The B-52s had been around a long time back in the 70s, and they really didn't make it big that everybody knew them until the late 80s. They were out of Athens, Georgia, same place REM is from.
Yeah, they formed in 76.
Yep.
So they had been around for, like you said, a good amount of time. That really was the introduction to mainstream music, I guess, or mainstream people, was that album, wasn't it? I mean, I don't remember ever hearing of them or seeing them or hearing their music.
You don't remember Rock Lobster?
Well, that was on that album, though, wasn't it?
I don't think Rock Lobster was on the same album as Love Shack.
I know Rock Lobster today because Peter Griffin plays it in an episode of Family Guy.
We were at the beach. Everybody had matching towels. Somebody went under a dock, and there they saw a rock. But it wasn't a rock. It was a rock lobster.
Which is kind of funny if you've ever seen the clip of it. I do remember Rock Lobster, but for some reason I thought that was on the same album, but maybe it wasn't.
Rock Lobster was on their first album in 1979.
Okay. And you know what it was? I found out about Rock Lobster after I found out about the B-52s, which was after Love Shack, which got, as you mentioned, videos were a big thing. It's not only a great karaoke song, it's not only a great song can you be in a bad mood listening to that song? I mean, if you're in the car and that came on the radio, could you possibly not have a smile on your face? I mean, it's so catchy and it's so good to listen to. But also they had that great video that went along with it.
Yeah.
So a lot of these bands took advantage of was that MTV era.
Love Shack was not my favorite song off that album. My favorite song was Rome, which was another great song. I love that song. Also on the list, other top songs that year, The Look by Roxette, kind of a flash in the pan band that had a huge couple of years and kind of just faded from existence. But The Look was a very high ranking song that year. End of the Innocents by Don Henley, member of the Eagles, of course. This was a few years after The Boys of Summer. Great sound, great song. Again, you hear it and it's like...
It takes you back.
It does. It starts with a piano solo, and playing piano is Bruce Hornsby.
Ah, okay. I did not know that.
Yes. Also that year, Handle with Care by the Traveling Wilburys, which was I guess you call them a super group. It was George Harrison, it was Roy Orbison, it was Tom Petty, it was Jeff Lynne from ELO, and Bob Dylan. So you had those five guys playing together as the Traveling Wilburys.
It was their first album. Most of those guys you mentioned, unfortunately, are no longer with us. Orbison died right before this was released. Orbison was not a young guy, and he had a renaissance with Pretty Woman with the movie and the re-release of his music and that. And he did the song Crying, right?
Yes.
That was tied in with a movie that made, I can't remember the movie's name now. Oh, God. It had John Cryer in it, and he was basically hiding in a high school as like part of like a witness relocation or something like that. And I can't remember the movie, but the song was on the soundtrack. And Orbison, he was a star from well before that, sort of
50s.
Got a renaissance. Yeah. And got a renaissance in the late 80s all of a sudden as part of this group and as a solo artist. So that's why I remember with that. But you mentioned Tom Petty was a part of that, right? And what else is on this list? Another classic song.
Yes, Free Fallin'. That year, Full Moon Fever, which is probably, my guess is that may have been his top-selling album of all time. I mean, he has a lot of great albums, but that was really the height of his career. He was pretty big at that point. Free Fallin' was a big song that year. You had others, too. That year, Love in an Elevator by Aerosmith. Again, talking about another band that had their biggest album ever in 1989. Aerosmith came out with Pump, their biggest album ever. And Love in an Elevator is still an iconic song to this day that you hear in the beginning of the song when he gets on the elevator and there's like an elevator attendant asking him, going down.
Second floor, hardware, children's wear, ladies' lingerie. Oh, good morning, Mr. Tyler. Going down.
And then you get, again, some more big artists here.
You have two guys who used to be in Genesis. So you have Mike and the Mechanics, which is Mike Rutherford, who is the guitar player from Genesis, The Living Years. And Another Day in Paradise by Phil Collins, who originally was the drummer of Genesis. But then when Peter Gabriel left Genesis, Phil Collins took over the lead vocals. And then Phil Collins went off on his own. Another Day in Paradise, very much a memorable song that everyone still will hear now. And you know exactly what that song is. Also that year, Mixed Emotions, which was the last top 20 song that the Rolling Stones ever had. That was part of their Steel Wheels album, and a pretty good song. Not one of my favorite Stones songs. I'm much more of a fan of early 70s Rolling Stones, but it was still a pretty good song. Speaking of artists from the 60s and 70s making a little bit of a renaissance, you had Cher in the top 20 with If I Could Turn Back Time. Again, a song that everybody knows, right?
Oh, yeah. Again, another one you'll hear and speaking of you could turn back time, it takes you back in time when you hear
absolutely.
That song, right? I mean, one quick note before you go too much further, because you're mentioning these artists back in the 80s that had been before and kind of seeing renaissances in their careers. And you mentioned the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones are still performing, are they not?
Yeah, they're touring this year. Yes. Tickets are outrageously expensive. My wife wanted to go, and I was like, I looked at the prices, and I'm like, yeah, we're not going.
Well, I do believe that they will be at Jazz Fest this year in New Orleans. They are one of the, and speaking of, you don't want to try to get tickets for that day at Jazz Fest if they're not already sold out. They were outrageously expensive. This is 30 years later, right? And they were old then.
Jazz Fest is doing something they've never done before. You need to see the Rolling Stones. You have to have a specific ticket to see the Rolling Stones.
Okay.
Normally, it's just you have a ticket for the day. You can go see whatever you want. You have to have a ticket to go see the Rolling Stones. So they have limited numbers of tickets specifically for that. They've never done that before.
I just have a question about the Rolling Stones. How in God's name is Keith Richards still alive? Is it all the drugs he took? Is that like preserving him like formaldehyde would? I mean, I just... That's been a running joke. I'm not the first one to make it, but I'm just stunned. I'm amazed.
There's an old joke that I used to use about my great-grandmother. May she rest in peace. She was a piece of work, my great-grandmother. She was particular, I guess. She was difficult, and she was very strong woman. And she lived until she was just shy of 100. And this is a woman who started smoking when she was 13, and when she had to go in for emergency cancer surgery when she was 80. She was told by the doctor that you really need to give up smoking. You have cancer, and this is probably what caused it. And she's like, I'm 80 years old. I'm not quitting now. And she literally smoked until the day she died. So she is one of the few who bucked the trend, bucked the odds, right? But my joke always was about her is that God didn't want her and the devil was scared of her. That's why she lived so long. You could make the same statement about Keith Richards.
Again, I'm just amazed that the Rolling Stones are still performing at this point in their career because they've been around forever. Yeah, they'll be featured, as I said, at Jazz Fest. Get your expensive tickets now if they're even still available. So other people on this list, not the Rolling Stones.
No, I put a bunch of these other songs on here because I kind of wanted to make a point. Part of what happened in 1989, in the mid 80s, actually, rap music got a big boost with Aerosmith and Run DMC doing that Walk This Way crossover video.
I remember that.
Right?
Yep.
Rap music was around before them, but that was really the first piece of rap music that made it into like the pop venue, right? And it was becoming more acceptable. Not so much acceptable. It was becoming more recognizable to the average radio listener. And you would hear more of it on regular radio, and you didn't have to listen to, R&B channels to hear it. So in 89, you started seeing more of that, and you started seeing videos of this on MTV, which again, there were complaints about MTV being very white. That was the music, right? There was Michael Jackson, but whether he was white at that point, I'm not quite sure. Or
he just wanted to be white.
Right.
He was trending white.
He was trending white at the time. Right. Exactly. But you had a bunch of very memorable rap songs that kind of made it into like the top 30, which was a first. So you had Young MC with Bust a Move. You had Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock with It Takes Two. And, you might have heard of that or might not have. There's a really funny scene in the movie The Proposal with Ryan Reynolds and Sandra Bullock, right? And she starts singing it, which is pretty funny. You had Wild Thing and Funky Cold Medina by Tone Loc. Very iconic songs, right?
You hear Wild Thing even today on a regular basis.
You hear both of those, and those are probably the only two Tone Loc songs you hear, and they both came out in 1989. And then also, Queen Latifah came out with her first album and her first single that year with Ladies First. So again, you're seeing a little bit of a transition happening in 1989. We'll get to the biggest piece of the transition a little later when we kind of wrap this whole thing up. Again, you started seeing the rap music being more widely accepted amongst a wider audience. And it started in 86, but it really started to take off in 89. And then obviously through the 90s, then you started seeing LL Cool J and Will Smith and all that kind of stuff. And then you started to get into, your heavier stuff, your Ice Cube, your Ice-T. But again, it was kind of a monumental moment where there was a definite shift going on. And we talked about some of these songs and the albums that they came from, but there were a lot of like very, very, very influential and famous albums that came out that year. I mean, we talked about Full Moon Fever with Tom Petty and Pump from Aerosmith. Those were the two top selling albums that those bands ever had. Steel Wheels came out for the Rolling Stones. I'm pretty sure that was I don't think they've had a better selling album since. They haven't really put out a whole lot of new music since then.
Haven't really needed to, though. I mean, I guess at this point, right?
Everyone wants to hear their old stuff because their old stuff is so good. I mean, you go to a concert, a lot of times you go to these concerts and they want to play their new songs. And a lot of times you're like, unless it's a really good album, you don't want to hear their new songs. I came here to hear the greatest hits. I want you to play your best music.
That would be like, you mentioned a guy earlier in Billy Joel, right? If you went to see Billy Joel in concert, aren't you expecting to hear Piano Man, for instance? I mean, he's got to play that, right? That's like arguably his most iconic song, right? Or one of them. You don't want to hear like, well, I just wrote this 10 days ago. No, that's not why that's not. And I assume when the Rolling Stones show up at Jazz Fest, no one's going to want to hear something that they put together in the van, coming over from the airport. They're going to want to hear Jumpin' Jack Flash or Brown Sugar or Satisfaction. That's the songs you're going to want to hear, among others, right? I mean, people like classics for a reason because they're classic, right?
And you talk about Billy Joel, and this is one of those things you may not know because you don't live here. Billy Joel has been what they call an artist in residence at Madison Square Garden now for going on 6 years. He plays one concert a month at Madison Square Garden.
Did you go to one?
I did.
I feel like you went to one. Yes.
I did. It was great. It was great. He sold out like 70 straight shows at Madison Square Garden. He plays once a month, every month. He lives in New York, so it's like for him, it's like a home game, right? He doesn't even have to travel. He just shows up and he plays. Right. And people go to listen to him play the greatest hits because he's one of those few guys who I think he has, if I'm not mistaken, 3 greatest hits albums, and they all are greatest hits. His library of greatest hits is so big that it takes 3 albums to put it on. You had that going on at that time. You also had the big hair bands. So you had New Jersey by Bon Jovi, one of their very famous albums. Appetite for Destruction, which may have been the biggest album Guns N' Roses ever had. You had Def Leppard, Hysteria, Skid Row with their self-titled album. So a lot of hair bands had albums that were really big.
Big hair.
Big hair, big music, a lot of hairspray.
That's what I was going to say. The hairspray bill's outrageous on these tours.
Not good for the environment. No. Definitely contributed to the hole in the ozone. Let's put it that way.
So you're basically blaming Bon Jovi for our ozone destruction. I can buy that. I can see that. and their contemporaries. Yes.
Yes. Also that year, you had Like a Prayer from Madonna, Rattle and Hum from U2. Which is kind of a interesting album. They had a song that they played with B.B. King on that album, and a lot of good music on that album. Very good one. Tracy Chapman came out with her debut album, her self-titled album, which everyone remembers, Fast Car, right?
Yep. That's the big hit for her. Yep.
That's the big hit. George Michael had at that point broken away from Wham, and Faith was his album that year.
It's funny. We talked about in our movie episode about Keanu Reeves and that other guy who was Alex Winter. Wham was George Michael and
Andrew Ridgeley.
there you go. Yeah, I knew you would know it. And how much has Andrew Ridgeley done since he left Wham?
Well, not much other than cash the checks.
That's true. There are residuals, right?
There are residuals, and there was a lot of good music that Wham made. Well, let me rephrase that. It wasn't great music. At the time, it was very poppy, and they had a lot of great songs that did very well in the charts that are still played to this day. So
again, I hear Careless Whisper is one of those songs that I hear continuously, and it holds up. It's still a good song, and willing to listen to it today and enjoy it. So but you're right. George Michael, when he broke out kind of on his own, that was his first solo album, wasn't it?
I don't know if it was his first. It definitely was his biggest. I feel like it may have been his first. I'll have to look that up. Also that year, Blind Man's Zoo by 10,000 Maniacs, which, Natalie Merchant. 10,000 Maniacs have been around for a long time, but again, they were kind of more cutting edge college radio in the 80s. And this is kind of when they made it more widely accepted, more on the pop realm. We mentioned End of the Innocence by Don Henley. Again, one of his great solo albums. That was after the Eagles had broken up the first time. And, he and Glenn Frey were putting out a lot of solo stuff at that time. And then we finally get to the last album I wanted to bring up. So all of this was happening in the late 80s. And an album debuted in late 1989 by a little-known band known as Nirvana from the Pacific Northwest. And their album was called Bleach. And that was the big transition that was coming. That was kind of the foreshadowing of the direction that music was going to go in the very short future. And that was the beginnings of grunge making it to the big time. Grunge had been around a while, but it was very much a regional thing in the Pacific Northwest. This is the first time that was starting to leave the Pacific Northwest and find its way to California, find its way east to New York. And by the time you get to 90 and 91, it's basically Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Metallica, a lot of these bands from the Pacific Northwest that just blew up. And Big Hair went out, and this is what replaced it. All of a sudden, it was less glam, and it was all flannels and ripped jeans. And, it was kind of a moment. Like I said, it took off after that, but started in 89.
Like grunge and rap really started gaining traction once we went into the new decade. And the more, I don't want to say sappy, but like a very traditional pop song type of music was what was not all of a sudden popular, what you would hear as much. And you're right. It's funny. It's the very end of the decade that signaled kind of the change in the guard, so to speak, of what was popular as far as people's listening habits went. So very, very influential debut album at the time, though I'm not sure anyone realized it, but we can look back in retrospect, right? And definitely say that.
Right. But what it was is that was kind of, the beginnings of people starting to experience it outside of the Pacific Northwest. Then people started discovering more bands, your Soundgardens, your Alice in Chains, even Hole. Hole started in 1989. Courtney Love, right?
Yeah.
You had Stone Temple Pilots started in 1989. It's about that time when it just about starts blowing up. It's a tremendous transition that you go from Bette Midler and Milli Vanilli and Paula Abdul and Bobby Brown to that.
That's definitely a change.
Yep.
And that's, like you said, that's definitely, you can't be much different than Bette Midler and Kurt Cobain. That's really about as far on the end of the spectrum as you can get, right?
No doubt about that. No doubt about that.
Yeah.
So the last thing I wanted to kind of go over is the top 10 music videos. And of course, this would be much better if we were actually a YouTube channel and we could actually show the videos themselves. But there were some, we mentioned some of the songs already, and they were also top videos. But there were other songs that were great videos. Again, memorable songs that most people will still remember. Like a Prayer was the number one music video. It was a song that the Catholic Church wanted to excommunicate Madonna about.
I remember that video
Yep.
because there were burning crosses
Yes.
in the background of the video. I don't think it was so much about the song lyrics. I think it was more about the visual representation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Madonna always pushed the envelope in anything she did. That was part of her shtick, but she knew that's what sold. And you can't really say anything other than she was wildly successful, because out of everybody you've mentioned, on this list, obviously the Rolling Stones are iconic. Billy Joel is iconic. Bette Midler is iconic. These are people that have had long-standing success. Isn't Madonna the biggest out of all of these, though? Is she the biggest star, the biggest name, even bigger than the Rolling Stones, would you say? Maybe even just as big influence-wise as the Rolling Stones were. I could make the argument she's the biggest musical star we have on this list, and it's an impressive list.
She probably is, because she's completely been pop-oriented, and pop always sells more than anything else. So she's probably the highest selling artist that we have on this list. Definitely very influential. You definitely brought that up. Much more became about the look, and she was constantly remaking herself, and every time she dropped a new album she looked different, and she was wearing something different, and she was setting trends, and girls were trying to dress like her all the time.
Yeah, how many different Madonna looks have there been over the years?
Oh my God, so many.
That initial look when she first started, and Like a Virgin was her first. I think that was her first big hit.
No,
wasn't it?
No.
You sure?
Holiday was her first big hit.
That was all in the same album. That's all around the same time then, right?
No, Like a Virgin was her second album.
Was that her second album?
Yeah. Her first album, and these songs, right? Lucky Star.
Yep.
Borderline.
Yep.
Holiday. Those are the three biggies. That was a self-titled album, Madonna. Her second album was Like a Virgin.
Okay. All right. She was already kind of big, though. Like a Virgin sold more. It looks like it sold more. Did it sell more? No, it didn't. Actually, her first album was platinum. Her second album in the U.S. was diamond, but it sold much more worldwide and sold more. How's this correct? So I'm reading, like I said, that her first album was platinum. Her second album was diamond, but her second album sold twice as many copies as her first album. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, diamond is bigger than platinum.
Is that how they do that?
Yes. Yeah, it's gold, platinum, diamond.
Well, duh. That shows my ignorance on how they rank the music rankings then. There you go.
Yes.
There's your proof, everybody, that I don't follow things in music quite as closely, that I didn't realize that. Yeah, Like a Virgin was a top album, and her first one was not as much. But yeah, sold 21 million copies of that album. That's a lot of copies.
Also, Material Girl was on that album. Dress You Up. Those are the songs that people are going to remember.
She had 3 straight number 1 albums in the U.S. Like a Virgin, True Blue, and Like a Prayer, which you mentioned here. That one sold 15 million worldwide, 5 million in the U.S. But her look seemed to change from album to album and sometimes song to song, right?
Yes. Going on from that top 10 list, number 2 was Straight Up by Paula Abdul, which we mentioned earlier, but that was the number 2 video. Number 3 was a band we didn't talk about, Fine Young Cannibals, with She Drives Me Crazy. Great music video, and it was the number 3 that year. Number 4 was a band that I actually saw open for Rolling Stones on their Steel Wheel tour back in 1989. I went to a concert at the old Shea Stadium, and that was Cult of Personality by Living Colour. That was an all-black kind of heavy rock band, and they all wore body glove scuba surf outfits. It was kind of weird, but they were great. They were a great band and put on a fantastic show. Again, I can absolutely picture that video. Remember seeing it back then, and I can visualize it in my head still to this day.
I can hear the song. That's what I was going to say. I can hear that title song. So
yeah. Number 5 was I Won't Back Down by Tom Petty, and we talked about that already. Number 6 was Paradise City by Guns N' Roses. Again, we talked about Guns N' Roses with Appetite for Destruction. Paradise City was not the biggest song on that album, but that year it was their biggest video. Also on the list, number 7 was Stand by R.E.M. And we didn't even talk about R.E.M. They were very influential. And again, another one of those college radio bands from the early 80s that kind of became a lot more mainstream not necessarily because they changed their music, but because mainstream started accepting that kind of music, right?
And again, MTV and the fact that they had music videos and you could see and you got exposed to it, that really kind of is what we're talking about with a lot of these bands and genres, isn't it? That kind of is the defining thread together that weaves all these very different music styles. And like, why did this catch on? Why did this catch on? Well, MTV really kind of helped to do that. I mean, that's where I had never heard anything from REM until I saw whatever it was I saw on MTV. And I can't remember, maybe it was Losing My Religion might have been one of the first big songs I heard from them, but they have plenty of great hits.
Yes.
Right? And I guarantee you, my first introduction to them was seeing them on a video on one of those two music channels.
Yep. And the last three on the list was Rocket by Def Leppard. Again, we talked about Hysteria coming out that year. Also, Every Little Step by Bobby Brown. And the final song in the top 10 was a band we hadn't talked about, but again, a kind of a big hair, glam rock type band was Great White, Once Bitten, Twice Shy. Again, that's probably their most famous song. It may not be what they're most famous for, but it is their most famous song.
Yeah, I was going to say what they're most famous for, unfortunately, is not a good thing.
No.
Unfortunately, yeah. For anybody listening who's not 100% sure about what that is, Great White was involved in the station nightclub fire, which was in 2003. The station, a little nightclub in Rhode Island, and they were performing live. And apparently that nightclub was very tiny, had only very few exits to it. They had probably too many people in there. Somebody decided it was a good idea to do pyrotechnics to start the show. That ignited all this foam soundproofing material in the ceiling, and the whole place burned down. And unfortunately, a lot of people died, including one of the members of the band, if I'm not mistaken, had passed away. I'm not sure which one of the members.
It was a guitarist, Ty Longley, who died, along with 100 other people, plus another 200 people who were badly burned, severe burns. So
the irony to that is that they actually had a TV station filming part of I guess what was going to be some sort of news report or documentary or something on nightclub safety. So there was someone filming in the nightclub from a TV station when the fire started, and that video and footage was caught and shown on the news and is available on YouTube for the people interested in the macabre. It's kind of frightening to watch because it's a sign of how quickly things can go out of control in a small environment, particularly when fire's involved, because fire moves really quickly, doesn't it? I don't remember Great White from back then, even though they had a top 10 music video. I don't remember them. I remember them from that incident, but all I remember at the time was that they were a band from, 20 years ago, right? That was performing. So it was sort of like a nostalgia thing for the people that were there to watch them. But I had no idea they had one of the top 10 videos in '89. So that was kind of a revelation when you sent the list over. I'm like, yeah, I know them. I just wish I didn't, unfortunately. I wish the whole situation was not what it was. But sadly, that's their lasting legacy off of more recent times.
That was the worst of Great White. The best of Great White was this music video. And that kind of concludes the music scene in 1989. Again, it was kind of transitioning from 80s pop and glam rock, big hair rock, and going into the beginnings of grunge and the continuation of rap into the mainstream.
Someone is welcome to correct us on this, but my guess would be, we talked about it when we looked at the movies, and it was like, what stands the test of time or what's going on. For this, it's maybe not so much what stands the test of time, because unlike the movies, there are some songs in here that are not nearly as iconic as others and certain artists that aren't. But my guess is if you looked to like 1985, or if you'd gone to 1995, gone a few years in either direction, you wouldn't see such a mishmash of different genres and different types, right? And different artists from different eras. This just seems to be almost, like you said, a very strange, unusual collection that was signaling a whole change in the medium altogether. And my guess is, like I said, you go back 5 years prior to that, that wouldn't have been the case. You would have said, yep, all these are kind of derivatives of one another. Same type of music styles, maybe something a little different here and there, but
you couldn't have nailed it on the head any more than that. And I just went back to
Woo, got it right.
1985. You did. It was a good guess, and it was, but it absolutely was the case. So this is 1985. Well, this will be the last thing we do before we get out of here. Here's your top songs: "Careless Whisper" by Wham, "Like a Virgin" by Madonna, "Wake Me Up Before You Go Go" by Wham, "I Want to Know What Love Is" by Foreigner, "I Feel For You" by Shaka Khan, "Out of Touch" by Hall & Oates, "Everybody Wants to Rule the World" by Tears for Fears, "Money for Nothing" by Dire Straits, "Crazy for You" by Madonna, "Take on Me" by Aha, "Every Time You Go Away" by Phil Collins, "Easy Lover" by Philip Bailey and Phil Collins. What do these songs all have in common? We heard this music for the first time when we watched the videos on MTV. All of this.
Yeah.
"Can't Fight This Feeling" by REO Speedwagon, "We Built This City" by Starship, "Power of Love" by Huey Lewis and the News, "Don't You Forget About Me" by Simple Minds, "Cherish" by Kool and the Gang, "St. Elmo's Fire" by John Parr, "The Heat Is On" by Glenn Frey, "We Are the World," USA for Africa, "Shout" by Tears for Fears, "Part-Time Lover" by Stevie Wonder, "Saving All My Love for You" by Whitney Houston. So you have a couple there that are more R&B. "Heaven" by Bryan Adams, the Miami Vice theme. It all was the same type of song. It was all the same. There wasn't the mix of different things. There was Duran Duran as I look further down, more Glenn Frey. You know what a lot of these songs are as I'm looking at these? Wow, I remember when they used these songs in Miami Vice.
Yeah.
Honestly.
The list you just listed sounds like if you were at a wedding and they started playing music in the background and you're talking to your friends and you're hearing music, you might not even notice the transition from one song to the other because they'd be so similar to one another. But again, my guess is if they played "Wind Beneath My Wings" and then "Funky Cold Medina" followed that up, right? And then something from Nirvana following up, you would hear a jarring transition from one to the other. That list and that 89 list, that's what you see. You see songs that are just on all sides of the spectrum and all different types of musical pieces. Whereas what you just read from, what did you say it was, 85?
That was 85. You want me to give you a quick thing on 95? And again, talking about how all the songs kind of were the same. We talked about how there was a very specific feel for 85. 89 didn't have that feel. 95 has the feel again. Coolio, TLC, Seal, Boyz II Men, Mariah Carey, Madonna, Montel Jordan. Here's another Boyz II Men. Michael Jackson, the Notorious B.I.G., so Biggie Smalls, so now you've got rap getting into the top 25. And more TLC, Soul for Real, Shaggy, Janet Jackson, Vanessa Williams.
It's not quite as homogenous as 85 is, but it's pretty close. Nothing in 89 does it feel that way. It's nowhere near all over the place that 89 was.
I gave you the artists. Here are the songs: "Gangster Paradise," "Waterfalls," "Kiss from a Rose," which wasn't that in a Batman movie, right?
Yeah, it was part of the soundtrack from Batman Forever. Yep.
"This Is How We Do It" by Montel Jordan. Again, something you hear it and you know what that is.
I'm jamming right now and you can't even see it. I'm just hearing that in my head. Yeah.
Are you dancing?
I am, well, sort of. It's white guy dancing, but it's awkward, but it's what it is,
89 had a very weird feel to it because it was transitioning, very much so. But anyway, that was a good call on your part to say that you thought that if you bookended it, it would seem different, and it sure did.
I was going to say, I started the episode by saying that, frankly, music is not my forte, other than I know how to listen to it. But at least I got that right. So, you were definitely the expert on a lot of this more than I was, but you picked a lot of good things to look at because I think it does represent, much like we saw with world events. Maybe not so much, when I said movie and TVs just seemed to be a classic thing for us. But when we talked about world events, we talked about how it was, a shifting of expectations and what we thought of the world. And music kind of, in many cases, a lot of times you'll see music follows culture, right? We saw that in the 50s. We saw that in the 60s. And the world was changing in 1989 and music was obviously changing. So it definitely mirrors it in that aspect. So the question is, as we end this episode, is what will we find when we look at sports? Because that's going to be our next part of our look at 1989. 1989 in sports featured a lot of big things, a lot of big events. Was it as earth-shattering as some of the world events we saw? Was it as entertaining as some of the movies we looked at? Was it as strange or dynamically different or all over the place as the music we looked at? That's going to be for our next episode in the series coming up sometime soon. In the interim, though, Stephen, why don't you go ahead and take us out, because I think we're done for this one.
We are. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we will catch you next time on Excruciating Minutia. Good night.
Thank you for listening to the Excruciating Minutiae Podcast. Check us out at excruciatingpodcast.com. Please subscribe to our podcast on any of your favorite podcast platforms and follow us on Twitter at excruciatingpod. See you at the next episode.